Ian McKelvey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's somewhat ironic, I guess, getting to speak on a bill that went through the Primary Production Select Committee some time ago. There's some members on that Select Committee that I don't know. There's some that I've never heard of. There's one in the House today. There's one in the House today who is dead lucky to be here still, and he's the last remaining one, the member for the West Coast. And so it's quite an unusual situation to find oneself in. And I remember, of course, 3 years ago coming here for the first time, getting to speak on a lot of bills I knew nothing about, and to come here 4 years later and get to speak on another one I know nothing about. It's quite an irony. But nonetheless, I now know a lot about it, and I'm going to make a few comments on it, because whilst the previous speaker from Napier made the point that this is not meant to be controversial, and I'm sure by the time it gets to Parliament it's not controversial, most of the issues that are dealt with by bills like this, and including this one, have gone through at times some quite controversial local consultation. In other words, they go through local councils. They almost invariably they are to do with local councils, their ability to use, to swap, or to transfer land, to even sell land. And often these are quite controversial issues in small local communities. By the time they get to the House, no doubt, they're no longer controversial. And as a former person who dealt or lived in the local government precinct for quite some time, I had a lot to do with these sort of things, and they concern all sorts of things that such as houses across boundaries of reserves, been there for generations. In fact, I've got one in my electorate right now of a very similar nature, where there's a house across a piece of land that was swapped under the Treaty of Waitangi, and the house is occupying a piece of that land. So councils need to move to try and rationalise these issues, and they need to come before Parliament, and the Reserves and Other Land Disposal Bill deals with these issues on an infrequent basis. They accumulate over time, and it's not unusual for cowsheds to be across road reserve boundaries. It's not unusual. In fact, it's very common for road reserves or roads to be on reserve land, where at the time they were put there, of course, there was no cognizance taken of where the boundary was, but nonetheless they become part of a reserve, and that's a frequent thing councils come across. In the 2004 floods in the Manawatu-Rangitikei, for example, there were numerous roads that needed major repairs making to them, often going across private property, going across reserve land, and in all sorts of places. And these necessitate land swaps and all sorts of issues like that. They come before the council, and often, because they are on reserve land, they need to come back to government for a decision. And so there's a lot of consultation goes on around this sort of stuff in councils, and often, as I said, in small local communities, there's quite a bit of interest in the small piece of reserve land that gets dealt with. This particular bill, of course, is dealing with some larger issues than that, and some of them are quite old, and as the Minister said, there'll be some significant changes made to this bill as we move along through supplementary order papers, and that's necessary as well, as things change pretty quickly, really, in this type of process, and decisions are made and we move on. I want to talk also about a reserve in the Manawatu district, for example, that was transferred to the regional council's governance. It needed to come through Parliament or become an act of Parliament in order for that transfer to take place, because it transferred between one local authority and another. You wouldn't imagine for a minute that would be necessary, but that's one of the complications that happens in the course of I guess, our law around land over hundreds of years, in fact. And I notice in this bill there's an item around the Winton racecourse. Racecourses are often governed under the Racing Act. Many of them are in reserve or put in reserve and held in perpetuity for community use. Whether they're racecourses or not in the long term, of course, is a matter of conjecture. But nonetheless, when they go to change use, they often have to become the topic of an Act of Parliament to get the land use changed. A&P showgrounds throughout New Zealand are in a similar situation. The 1904 A&P Societies Act contains or controls a large number of A&P showgrounds right throughout New Zealand, and often these also have to become part of an act or need a local member's bill or a private member's bill to change the land use of those pieces of land in the Palmerston North City ANP showgrounds in Palmerston North, a classic example of that, required an Act of Parliament in order for the City Council to be able to take them out of the ANP's ownership. And of course they've moved over to Fielding now. As the Minister referred to, there are two substantive changes referred to in the Select Committee report on this bill, and interestingly I think that will be the intention to withdraw both of those or cancel both of those as a result of consultation that's taken place since this bill became part of or came to Parliament in 2008. And so it's not surprising, I guess, that there are some changes needed to be made as a result of that. I'm quite sure that we can see a number of further changes made to it during the course of the committee stages as a result of the same debate, because, as I said earlier, these types of issues are constantly before local government and they constantly need to be reviewed. And so whilst it's a very slow process, and I think the previous bill came into the House in, I think, 2003, scarcely in memory, and we now have got to 2015 and we're just about to pass the next bill. Fortunately, most people or most organisations that are dealing with these kind of things aren't frustrated by the time factor, because they've been here forever and they're going to be here forever in the future. It's just a pedantic issue of who has control of the land often, who's able to make decisions on it. And interestingly, as a result of the sale of reserve land, the government pockets half of it anyway. So it's not of great interest to local communities to sell reserve land, because they give half that the value of that land to the government. The other half the councils get their hand on. And so who knows whether the local community is going to get a great deal of benefit out of this anyway. So it's really a rationalisation process. And in the case of councils, they often have quite large tracts of land, not in one place, of course, many, many small pieces of land that are in these types of situations. They're expensive to administer and they're a little bit of a nuisance, but they're very hard to deal with as well. And so it's really in council's interest that we get bills like this before Parliament every now and again and make sure we get them, I guess, passed in a form that enables the community to move on and I guess allows them to move on to the next step, really. So I'm very pleased to see, Mr Speaker, that at least the Labour Party are supporting this bill. I'm sure New Zealand First will support this bill. I can't guarantee that my colleague down there in the Greens will support it, though. But he's not here today, Stephen, but... Oh, I'm sorry. Apologies, Mr Speaker. He's here in spirit.
Your apology is noted on the record.
He's here in spirit. I'm not sure whether he'll support it or not. But it is an interesting topic, and it's one, as I said, that's very complicated in the background, but relatively simple when it gets to Parliament to be passed. I'm also very pleased to see, Mr Speaker, that a few members of the Manawatu district have come to listen to this debate, enlightening and exciting as it will be.
And I'll just remind the member that referring to people in the galleries is a breach.
Apologies, Mr Speaker.
But that's now on the record as well.
The member for West Coast is probably quite right. So, Mr Speaker, it gives me a great deal of pleasure to support this bill as it moves to the next stage in Parliament, and I'm sure that the committee stage, the debate in the committee stage of this bill will be highly enlightening, and I look forward to listening to that debate with interest and even participating in it. And I notice the member from West Coast just can't wait to get up, so thank you, Mr Speaker.
And that's on the